Thank you guys so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be able to talk to such a great group of people. I just, as I was looking in, saw how many people are on the call and trying to feel excited, even though I can't see all of you guys. So I put these slides together really what now seems like a lifetime ago, even though it was a few weeks ago. And talking about carpooling, I think I have to just acknowledge is a little bit strange at a time when most of us aren't commuting any further than our living rooms. But I do firmly believe that carpooling is an essential tool in our transportation toolkit and is really a critical piece of how we are going to improve social equity and fight climate change. I know that coming out of this crisis, there might be sort of more of an increased emphasis on telework, but I also know and have been, just devouring way too much media lately that for many Americans and for many around the globe, teleworking is not an option now and it's not going to be an option. There's people who work in retail and food service, warehousing and manufacturing and more. And those people are some of the people being hardest hit by this epidemic right now. And there's some of the people who will stand to benefit the most if all of us can really get serious about carpooling again. So I'm going to dive in and talk about why I believe that carpooling matters and will matter more than ever. So, I don't think that it will be a surprise to anyone on this call that way too many people in our country still drive alone. And, when driving alone is actually a thing that we can do to get to work. I think that when we think about this, sometimes we think that people are doing this because they love their cars so much. But I think as some of the other presenters have even pointed out, people are doing this not because they are passionately in love with their cars, but they're making a semi-rational decision. The FHWA shows us that the average commute distance in the US is about 13 miles, which is just simply too far for some of the more newfangled kind of micro-mobility that's come out to really serve that trip effectively. And then data from Governing Magazine, looking at American commute survey data, finds that even in some of the largest US metros, the ones that we think about as having the best transit systems, and drilling down even further to some of the specific metros that do have the most dense transit coverage, it's still between 1.5 and 1.9 times longer to make a commute trip by public transit versus driving alone. So people who are making this decision are making it from a fairly rational point of view. Sorry, this is advancing. Even though this is a rational decision, driving alone, is faster, but it's obviously not free. The choice that people are making is putting a terrible burden on household economics. Americans who are trying to optimize for cost might be choosing to live further out from job centers, but they wind up kind of stuck in this double bind. The Center for Neighborhood Technology finds that if you look at not just the cost of housing when you think about affordability, but the cost of housing and transportation together, they make nearly 75% of American neighborhoods unaffordable to average residents in that market. So that's pretty shocking. And this isn't really, this is really just, not just an impact on the household level, it also has real implications when you look at the entire regional economy. So where we choose to live and the means that we have available for us to get to work affects obviously our ability to access jobs, not just today, but in the future. And at that macro level, it also affects the ability of employers to be able to attract and retain the best talent for their needs. And at a regional level, it affects the ability of different regions to compete against each other for employers and for the economic benefits that it comes from having a robust employer community. The typical US job is accessible to only about a quarter of its metropolitan workforce by transit in 90 minutes or less. That means if you don't have access to a car, you're essentially cut off from opportunity. And sort of the reverse of that is that employers are cut off from you. They don't have access to you as part of their talent base. And these impacts are disproportionately affecting certain folks in our society. So African Americans are 5 times as likely to not have a car when compared to white Americans. And so you start to see that these impacts aren't just region to region, but also really affect who you are based on race and socioeconomics. Um, Brookings did some research a few years ago. Some of these numbers obviously are a few years old, but I don't think that the overall trends have changed. And they looked at change in proximity to jobs. And really what this is about the fact that our metro areas are changing. It used to be that people would choose to live and work along transit lines, but as those locations have really commanded more premium rents, we see patterns shifting and people choosing to live and businesses choosing to locate further from transit. Brookings found that between 2000 and 2012, the number of jobs accessible within the quote unquote typical commute of what was then 12 and now 13 miles fell by 7%. But what's more staggering is not just sort of the spreading out of where people live versus where they work. It's really staggering how uneven the impacts of this are. If you're Black or brown or poor, the number of jobs near you actually fell by 14 to 17%. So just take that in. So, you know, you're just being, you know, hit even harder. Putting that into a format that is maybe more accessible to folks to look at in terms of a map, looking at the DC metro area, which is actually the nation's fourth most transit accessible market for jobs in the country. This is data that was compiled by the University of Minnesota, looking at jobs that are accessible via driving versus transit. And so even though the DC metro area has a good transportation network, has lots of jobs that are accessible by transit, having a car opens up so many more opportunities for a job seeker. And again, if you drill down into this more, you see that there's racial disparities also in this. So how do we fix it? I am a believer in structural change, but I'm also a pragmatist, and I know that structural change is slow. Here are just two examples, and I could have pulled, you know, probably 100 more. But this is looking at two things that I think that we really need to do. I think that we really obviously need to build more transit, and hopefully some of the funding coming out of this crisis will enable us to do that and do it more quickly. I also think that we need to reform land use policies. And when you look at what places like Minneapolis did in this last year, it's pretty remarkable to see real leadership on that front. But those changes, even when they are made, happen very, very slowly. And we have crises that are facing us today in terms of climate and in terms of affordability that we need to address now. LA residents voted to tax themselves to expand the transit system. It's being built in 3 phases, partly due to the availability of federal funds. It's going to take somewhere between 9 and 13 years to build a 9-mile extension of the Purple Line. That is time when people are still having to figure out how to manage every day, how to get to work, how to get to other types of opportunities. Changing those land use policies, changing zoning. I looked at an example near where I live in downtown Brooklyn. They rezoned downtown Brooklyn in 2004. In the 14 years since, they have added a remarkable amount of new housing, but when you look at the numbers a little bit more closely, you find that 57%, almost 60% of that new housing has been added just in the last 4 years alone. So it really takes time to ramp up to those types of changes that we need. So that's why I'm really captivated by this idea of carpool. It is one of the few things that really has the ability to be put in place in the really near term as we work towards those longer term changes that are needed so desperately. It scales very easily at little cost to individuals. There's no new infrastructure needed. Employers can get involved in the solution. Governments can get involved in the solution in a very cost-effective way. We have to get serious about this again. I think one of the reasons why we don't get serious about it is that for most of us, when we think about carpooling like this. It kind of brings to mind kind of a grainy Kodachrome image from the 1970s. And this actually is my dad, who carpooled through the 1970s and early 80s near DC. At that point, there was an oil crisis, and so carpooling became an attractive thing to do. And most people found out about it by word of mouth or a physical bulletin board at work. And now I think it kind of does seem to most people like this kind of dated mode. What I hope that you guys come away thinking about carpooling as is something much different and more modern. I believe that carpooling can rise again because of solutions that are platform-based solutions like Waze Carpool and Ride Amigos, which are really transforming the experience of carpooling, making it more modern and flexible and seamlessly integrated, which is, how people really expect to move around today when we are allowed to move around. Platforms like these also enable decision makers to have a rich data source about how people are traveling and allows them to incentivize sustainable transportation behavior, track progress towards VMT reduction and CO2 removed. For example, last year, US Wazers carpooled 25 million miles together, reducing carbon emissions by 20 million pounds overall. So we're seeing firsthand that this is possible, and we're able to track exactly how that works. And when we finally come out of the most kind of immediate medical impacts of this crisis and begin dealing with the economic fallout, it's solutions like these that help connect people more affordably with jobs, I believe, that are going to be more important than ever before. So for me, the call to action today is really that it's time to reimagine what carpooling is and the role that it can play in our local and regional transportation networks. So thank you guys very much for giving me some of your time. And thank you so much to Ride Amigos for having us.
Thank you, Danny, and we really appreciate the insight that you bring into why carpool is still, even in the midst of all the strangeness that we are currently living through, something that we can all be thinking about as an effective solution to be looking towards as we move to the future. I've got a couple of great questions here that I'd love to share with you. One of the first is kind of this elephant in the room around the current crisis and stay at home and all of that. Do you have any thoughts yet? Obviously, this is all very fresh to all of us in the industry. Any thoughts, or have you heard anything around ideas for new protocols, conscious or subconscious, that might emerge as we start thinking about carpooling when we start moving back in that direction?
I haven't really right now. I mean, I think that the general guidance around the world right now is to do social distancing and to try to provide 6 feet between you and anyone else. And so I think that is, challenging to do in cars. I think if it is absolutely necessary for first responders and people to be able to get to work, I think that there is some, some potential to take extraordinary measures, but I don't think I'd recommend that for regular average citizens at this point. I think the nice thing about how Waze Carpool works is that there's no blind matching. So it's not like someone is just picking you up that you've never met before. You really get to know a little bit about the person that you're either going to pick up or the person who's picking you up. And you can really have an exchange through the platform that allows you to ask questions about their health status and things like that in advance. We can also do carpool groups for employers. And so, as employers start to get back to work, if you look to Asia to how some of that is happening, it seems like sometimes employers are sort of breaking up employees into like A and B teams or A, B, C, and D teams and kind of rotating shifts of people in and out on different days. And I think that, there's cases that you could actually imagine creating carpool groups at that level of specificity to help make it easier for people to get to work, but only match with other people that they're already sort of going with, so that you're not, you're kind of minimizing the potential exposures. But I think right now we are really doing all we can to try to lay the groundwork and prepare for hopefully a time when we get back closer to normal, because obviously this is not exactly the time when carpooling is top of mind for folks.
That is definitely the case, and we, here at Ride Amigos, we're hearing the same thing, and obviously this is something that across the industry that we're all trying to figure out, and so we really appreciate the way that you and your team are working through that, and also just the way that you kind of put carpooling in the bigger context of the future of smart commuting and issues like equity and stuff as well. So thank you for bringing that as part of the CommuteCon program today. We're going to go ahead and switch to our next speaker, but we really appreciate you being here and helping to sponsor CommuteCon. We couldn't do it without you.
Thank you.